The sound of blood drops falling on the soaked straw echoed in the Place de la Révolution like a macabre metronome, marking the final seconds of an era. It was October 16, 1793, and the guillotine's blade still trembled from the impact as the executioner held up by her hair the severed head of the woman once called the most beautiful princess in Europe. Marie Antoinette's blue eyes, once sparkling like sapphires in the salons of Versailles, now gazed into the void with an expression of terror frozen in time. The crowd roared like a hungry beast finally satiated, but few there knew that this brutal death was merely the conclusion of an agony that stretched over 4 years of humiliations, psychological torture, and a degradation so systematic that it transformed a queen into a ghost long before her execution. Marie Antonia Josepha Johanna of Habsburg-Lorraine arrived in France in 1770 as a child of only 14, bringing with her the scent of Schönbrunns roses and the naivety of someone who grew up amidst bohemian crystals and imperial gardens. Daughter of the powerful Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, she disembarked on French soil not as a person, but as a living symbol of a political alliance intended to consolidate peace between two European powers. Her delicate feet, still accustomed to Viennese marbles, stepped for the first time on Versailles' silk carpets, unaware that she was walking on a volcano about to erupt. The handover ceremony was a spectacle of cold, calculated protocol, completely stripped of her Austrian clothes by ladies of the French court, as if her very identity were a dress to be discarded. She emerged naked and trembling in a golden tent, to be reclothed in French fabrics that would symbolically transform her from an Austrian archduchess into the future Queen of France. The marriage to the Dauphin Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, was celebrated in May 1770 with a pomp that cost the equivalent of tens of millions of euros today. Versailles shone like never before. Thousands of candles illuminated the Hall of Mirrors, the gardens displayed fountains that would gush perfumed water for days, and the young Archduchess, now Dauphine of France, danced for the first time under the gaze of a court that watched her like hawks studying prey. Her golden hair, styled in elaborate towers decorated with ostrich feathers, pearls, and even miniature ships in homage to French naval victories, became legendary. She wore dresses weighing over 20 kilograms, embroidered with gold thread and precious stones, and her jewels, a diamond necklace valued at entire fortunes, reflected the light like stars fallen from the sky. But behind all that magnificence, Marie Antoinette was still a frightened teenager, crying alone in her chambers, and writing desperate letters to her mother, pleading for advice on how to navigate the treacherous waters of the French court. During the first years of her reign, which began in 1774 when she and Louis XVI were crowned, Marie Antoinette lived like a goddess among mortals. Versailles was her golden playground, where every whim was immediately satisfied by hundreds of servants who bowed in her presence. She awoke at noon in a bed with gold-embroidered canopies, was bathed in perfumed water with rose essences imported from Damascus, and dressed by a complex hierarchy of ladies-in-waiting, each responsible for a specific piece of her wardrobe. Her days were filled with card games, where she gambled sums that could feed entire villages, strolls through the gardens in carriages ornamented with ivory and mother-of-pearl, and balls that stretched until dawn, where she danced minuets with the grace of a fairy among courtiers, who whispered flatteries in her ears like prayers. She built a private theater where she performed pastoral plays, fantasizing about being a peasant while real peasants starved in the streets of Paris. At the Petit Trône, her personal refuge within Versailles, she created an artificial village complete with perfumed sheep, cows with colorful ribbons, and a cheese factory decorated with Sèvres porcelain, where she played at being a simple shepherdess while the kingdom crumbled around her. The first winds of the storm began to blow in the 1770s, initially manifesting as poisonous whispers circulating through the gloomy corridors of Versailles and the salons of Paris. The French court, envious of the young queen's influence, began spreading rumors about her alleged extravagances and her Austrian origin. Anonymous pamphlets circulated through the capital describing her as l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, a term loaded with scorn that insinuated she was a spy serving foreign interests. The first pornographic libels appeared around 1775, grotesque illustrations depicting her in obscene situations with imaginary lovers, systematically destroying her reputation. With every invented scandal, every fabricated story about her supposedly exorbitant expenses, though they represented only a fraction of the royal budget, her name became more hated in the taverns and markets of Paris. The famous affair of the diamond necklace, in 1785, was the final blow to her reputation, even though she was the victim of an elaborate scam perpetrated by adventurers who forged her signature. She was found guilty by public opinion, which was already convinced of her corrupt nature. When the revolution finally erupted in 1789, Marie Antoinette watched from the windows of Versailles as the first flames of rebellion spread across the horizon like an uncontrolled wildfire. The crowds marching towards the palace were no longer subjects bowing in reverence, but faces contorted by fury, clenched fists raised in the air, hoarse voices shouting words she barely understood, but whose tone of hatred was unmistakable. The first great humiliation came on the morning of October 5, 1789, when thousands of Parisian women, armed with scythes, clubs and kitchen knives, invaded Versailles, demanding bread and justice. They forced open the doors to the royal apartments, chased the queen through the corridors, where she had once danced minuets, and only narrowly escaped being lynched right there, saving herself by seconds, by taking refuge in the king's rooms. Her clothes were torn by the eager fingers of the crowd, her hair disheveled, and for the first time in her life, Marie Antoinette tasted the metallic tang of real fear in her mouth. When she finally managed to appear on the royal balcony to calm the crowd, she was pale as a ghost, visibly trembling, her eyes red from suppressed tears. The royal family was forced to leave Versailles and move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, but that royal residence quickly became a golden prison. Marie Antoinette, who once commanded the protocols of one of Europe's most sophisticated courts, now lived under constant surveillance. Revolutionary guards marched through the marble halls with their muddy boots, smoking pipes and spitting on the floor, where once only respectful whispers echoed. She could no longer leave without an escort, could not receive visitors without authorization, could not even choose her own clothes without them being inspected by Republican officials looking for secret messages hidden in the folds of the fabrics. Her jewels were confiscated one by one, her court dresses replaced by simple cotton clothes that made her aristocratic skin appear even paler and more delicate. In the letters she managed to send secretly to her family in Austria, using invisible inks and elaborate codes, she described how her hands, once soft as petals, were now rough and cut, forced to sew her own clothes and attend to household chores that all her aristocratic education had protected her from knowing. If you are following this account and wish to continue discovering stories that reveal the darker and most fascinating aspects of human history, consider subscribing to our channel to receive more narratives like this, which delve into the depths of human experience with the same intensity and historical precision. The royal family's attempted escape in June 1791 marked the beginning of the cruelest chapter of Marie Antoinette's agony. The operation, known as the Flight to Varennes, had been planned for months with the precision of a military operation. Disguised as a governess, her face covered by a simple veil and wearing peasant clothes that made her royal posture seem even more incongruous, she tried to escape Paris in a carriage with the king and their children. But the conspiracy was discovered, and they were captured just a few leagues from the Austrian border. The return to Paris was a via dolorosa of humiliations. Crowds gathered along the road to insult the royal family, spitting on the carriage, shouting "Mort au traître," death to traitor. Marie Antoinette remained upright throughout the journey, her chin held high in a last remnant of royal dignity, but witnesses reported that silent tears constantly streamed down her face, leaving glistening trails that dried and were replaced by new tears in an endless cycle of despair. Confinement in the Temple Tower, where the family was transferred in August 1792, transformed the former Queen of France into an ordinary prisoner. The medieval tower, damp and cold, was infested with rats that scurried through the stone corridors, producing a constant sound of small claws scratching the silence. Marie Antoinette, who had once slept on swan-down mattresses covered with Leon silks, now shared a cramped room with the entire family, sleeping on a hard cot covered only by rough sheets. Her meals, which once included dozens of dishes served on Sèvres porcelain by white-gloved footmen, were reduced to watery soups and black bread served in chipped earthenware bowls. But the most refined torture was psychological. She could hear through the stone walls the screams of the crowd that gathered daily outside the prison, chanting obscene songs about her and demanding her death with a regularity that transformed hatred into a kind of diabolical liturgy. The execution of King Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, broke something fundamental in Marie Antoinette's spirit. She learned of her husband's death not through an official communiqué, but through the joyous shouts of the crowd that echoed through the Temple Tower like waves of a tsunami of cruelty. Witnesses from the time describe how she remained motionless for hours after receiving the news, sitting in her wooden chair, her eyes fixed on the void, her lips parted as if trying to utter words that never came out. Her hands, always elegant, began to tremble uncontrollably, and this tremor never completely ceased. Rosalie Lamorlière, one of the maids who managed to stay with her until the end, reported in her memoirs that from that date, Marie Antoinette seemed to converse with ghosts, whispering answers to questions no one else had asked, as if living simultaneously in the cruel present and in memories of a golden past that had become more real than the reality around her. The forced separation from her children in July 1793 completed the destruction of the woman Marie Antoinette had become. Her eldest son, the Dauphin Louis Charles, just 8 years old, was torn from her arms by soldiers who took him to be re-educated, according to Republican principles. She clung to the child with desperate strength, her nails leaving marks on the guards' uniforms, screaming with a voice that no longer seemed human. The terrified boy stretched his little arms towards her as he was carried away, his blue eyes, so much like hers, overflowing with tears she would never again dry. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse was kept with her for a few more weeks, but the 14-year-old girl had become a shadow of herself, speaking only in whispers, and spending hours watching her mother with a concern that should not exist in such young eyes. When they finally took her daughter as well, Marie Antoinette completely collapsed. She spent 3 days without eating, without speaking, just pacing back and forth in her cell like a wounded animal searching for an exit that didn't exist. The transfer to the Conciergerie prison in August 1793 marked the beginning of the final phase of her agony. If the Temple Tower was a royal prison, the Conciergerie was a human slaughterhouse. Cell number 280, where she was confined, measured only 4 square meters, with damp walls that constantly exuded a sticky, foul-smelling substance. The smell of mold, human excrement, and decaying bodies permeated the air so much that she vomited constantly, her stomach rejecting even the few foods they managed to offer her. Rotten straw covered the stone floor, where she slept curled up in a thin blanket that couldn't protect her from the cold that penetrated to her bones. 2 female guards constantly watched her, reporting every movement, every word, every sigh, turning her existence into a spectacle of constant degradation. They attended to their intimate needs in the presence of these women, who observed her with cruel curiosity, as if witnessing the dismantling of a work of art. During the 2.5 months she spent in the Conciergerie, Marie Antoinette experienced a physical deterioration that shocked even her jailer. Her golden hair, once her glory, turned completely white in a matter of weeks, becoming sparse and brittle like strands of dry straw. Her skin, once compared to Meissen porcelain for its purity and smoothness, acquired a grayish hue and became covered with wounds that wouldn't heal due to malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. She lost so much weight that her clothes, already simple, hung loosely on her body like empty sacks. Her hands, once adorned with the most beautiful rings in Europe, were now swollen and covered with infected cuts. but witnesses from the time describe how her eyes, once compared to sapphires, completely lost their luster, becoming opaque and sunken, like bottomless wells where light could no longer penetrate. Marie Antoinette's trial, which began on October 14, 1793, was a judicial farce as elaborate as it was cruel. For 2 days, she was forced to stand before the Revolutionary Tribunal, answering accusations that included treason, espionage, corruption of her children, and conspiracy against the nation's liberty. Fouquier-Tinville, the public prosecutor, presented evidence that was mostly rumors, forged letters, and testimonies from people who had never met her personally. But Marie Antoinette, even reduced to that shadow of herself, found the strength to respond with a dignity that impressed even her enemies. Her voice, though weak, remained firm when denying the most absurd accusations. "I never taught my children to consider the French people as enemies," she declared. And for a moment, in that hate-filled tribunal, the voice of the Queen she once had been echoed. But everyone knew the verdict had been decided before the trial even began. The guillotine awaited her like an altar where she would be sacrificed, not for her real crimes, but for representing a world the revolution wanted to destroy forever. Marie Antoinette's last night was spent in a vigil that mixed terror and a strange serenity. Father Henri Girard, who managed to visit her in disguise, later reported that she spent hours on her knees on the damp straw, praying with an intensity that seemed to want to concentrate a lifetime of faith into those final moments. Her tears fell constantly, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of a purification she herself didn't fully comprehend. She asked for paper and ink to write a last letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, a letter that would become one of the most poignant pieces of prison literature worldwide. "I die free of hatred for those who condemn me," she wrote with a trembling but still elegant hand. "I hope my death brings happiness to France and that my children find in this country, which I loved so much, all the benefits it deserves." The letter, intercepted by the authorities, never reached its destination, but the words remained as a testament to a soul that, even shattered, could still forgive. The dawn of October 16, 1793, arrived with a dense fog that enveloped Paris like a shroud. Marie Antoinette awoke, if she had indeed slept, to the sound of her execution preparations, the dragging of wood in the square, the shouts of street vendors announcing "good view to see the widow Cape," the name by which the revolutionaries called her, denying her even her royal identity. When the executioner arrived to cut her hair, she did not resist, letting him undo the last vestiges of her former glory with abrupt, impatient movements. The golden and white strands fell to the ground like withered flower petals, and when he finished, she ran her hand over her shaven head with a gesture of strange curiosity, as if touching a stranger's head. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution lasted exactly 35 minutes, but for Marie Antoinette, it must have seemed like an eternity. Tied with rough ropes that cut her wrists, she was placed in an ordinary cart, not the gilded carriage in which she had so often paraded through the streets of Versailles, surrounded by mounted guards, and followed by a crowd of over 30,000 people who shouted insults, sang obscene songs, and threw mud and excrement at her. She remained upright throughout the journey, her eyes fixed on a distant point above the heads of the crowd, as if contemplating something invisible that only she could see. Witnesses reported that her lips moved constantly, probably in silent prayers, and that a strange serenity had taken hold of her face, as if the proximity of death had freed her from the fear that had tormented her for so long. When she finally reached the guillotine, Marie Antoinette walked to the scaffold on her own feet, refusing to be carried by the soldiers. Her last steps on earth were taken with a dignity that contrasted cruelly with the savagery of the crowd around her. As she ascended the wooden steps leading to the execution platform, she stumbled slightly, and instinctively, stepped on the foot of the executioner, Charles Henri Sanson. Her last words were an apology. "Pardon, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose. a moment of aristocratic courtesy that survived until the very last second of her life. Sanson, experienced in executions, would later admit that this gesture of politeness in the supreme moment disturbed him more than any cry of despair could have. When she was positioned on her knees before the guillotine, her head secured in the wooden lunette, Marie Antoinette had a few final seconds of consciousness. The world around her narrowed to primary sensations: the smell of wet wood, the animal roar of the crowd, the cold October wind touching her bared neck. Then at 12:15 p.m., the blade fell with a dry thud that cut through the air like thunder, and the life of Marie Antoinette of Habsburg-Lorraine, widow Capet, former Queen of France, came to an end so abruptly that the crowd took a few seconds to understand that the spectacle was over. The executioner held up the severed head by its sparse hair, displaying it to the four directions of the square. As blood dripped onto the wooden platform, the crowd erupted in cheers of jubilation, but some witnesses reported a moment of strange silence, as if even the most fervent revolutionaries felt the weight of what had just happened. The headless body was thrown into an ordinary coffin along with the head, and both were transported to the Madeleine Cemetery, where they were buried in a common grave with quicklime, the same substance used to rapidly decompose the remains of common criminals. But Marie Antoinette's death did not end her story; it transformed it into something even more powerful and unsettling. In the months following her execution, reports began circulating of her ghost appearing in the corridors of Versailles, always dressed in a blood-stained white gown, searching for the children who had been torn from her. Rosalie Lameurière, her last maid, spent the rest of her life tormented by nightmares, where she heard the former queen's voice calling for her children amidst the sounds of the guillotine. Charlotte Corday, before her own execution, declared having seen Marie Antoinette in dreams, warning her of the horrors to come. Even some of the most staunch revolutionaries began to show remorse. Fouquier Tinville, the prosecutor who had conducted her trial, was later executed by the same guillotine, and his last words were a plea for forgiveness addressed to the ghost of the dead queen. The cruelty of Marie Antoinette's death did not lie solely in the guillotine. That was merely the final act of a symphony of horrors that lasted 4 years. The true cruelty was the systematic destruction of everything she was: her identity, her dignity, her humanity, her motherhood, her hope. She was forced to watch the demolition of her world piece by piece, person by person, symbol by symbol, until only a broken body awaited the end. The revolution was not content to kill her; it wanted to humiliate her, diminish her, transform her from a symbol of power into a symbol of decay, from a goddess into a beggar, from a mother into an orphan of her own children. Today, more than 2 centuries later, when we visit Versailles and walk through the halls where Marie Antoinette danced her last minuets, it's hard not to feel the echo of her presence, not the frivolous queen of the revolutionary labels, but the woman who faced death with more courage than many of her tormentors displayed in life. Her story reminds us that behind every political symbol, every historical representation, there is always a human being with fears, hopes, pains, and an infinite capacity for both frivolity and dignity. Marie Antoinette died as a symbol of a regime, but her agony was profoundly, painfully human, and perhaps it is this humanity, revealed in the most extreme moments, that makes her story not just a historical account, but a dark mirror where we can still recognize our own fragilities, and paradoxically, our own capacity to transcend them when we reach the absolute limit of our endurance.